So this story is why people check under their bed at night, and it follows a really popular urban legend often referred to as humans can lick too, or the licker. We provide terrifying tales of crimes, folklore, urban legends and their true origins. If you haven't already, then please like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on any of our weekly uploads. Check you've locked your doors and sleep under the covers. This one even made me shudder. We start with Margaret, who was an only child, aged 12 in 1877. She lived in a small farm cottage in rural Sussex in England. Margaret lived at home with her father and mother, who both adored her. They had an elderly mongrel called Pep, aged 11. Pep often would like to follow Margaret around wherever she would go, whether that be in the garden, sitting by the fire, or laying under Margaret's bed at night. It was a cold November's evening, and after Margaret had spent the day helping her mother sweep the brick floors in their cottage, she then assisted her father in the afternoon to chop wood for the fire. Margaret knew that her grandmother had been suffering from a chest infection, and her parents had been visiting on the cooler evenings to try and keep the grandmother's fire going, in the hope that this may aid her recovery and keep her warm. This particular day was extremely cold, and Margaret was expecting for her parents to inform her that they would be going to the grandmother's in the neighbouring village. Margaret would often stay at home and keep the fire going for Pep, because their dog at the ripe age of 11 would also feel the cold and they didn't want the animal getting poorly. After Margaret's mother had prepared a broth, as expected, her father explained that they would indeed be staying at her grandmother's to ensure that she was comfortable throughout the cold night. Margaret wasn't worried, as she had been left at the family home several nights already, and her mother would leave her a whole pot of broth, which is something that she would usually have to share with her parents. The family were not a wealthy family, and often had to ration food. The fact that Margaret was able to fill her belly for a night was a real treat for her, which is why she was more than happy for her parents to go away for the night. Margaret's parents set off around 8 p.m. and left a broth boiling on the fire. Margaret watched and waved to her parents until they eventually disappeared around the corner through the thick hedges and brambles. Margaret stood outside for a moment, rubbed her hands together to warm them, before disappearing through the little 5-foot oak door on the front of the cottage. Once inside, Margaret walked through the lounge and round the back into the kitchen, with Pep following her. Margaret got out a couple of bowls, one for her, one for Pep, and a spoon to dish up the broth with. After Margaret had dished up, she placed one bowl on the floor and one bowl on the bench that was situated in the kitchen. She sat on a wooden stool and raised each spoon and took a sip of her broth. She enjoyed the warm feeling as it went down her body after being out in the freezing November's evening. After Margaret and Pep had finished eating their broth, Margaret decided that she would kill a little bit of time by looking at her father's sketchings of wildlife. She sat in a rocking chair by the fire with Pep at her feet. After around half an hour had passed, Margaret began to feel the cold, and she decided that she might retire to bed. She stood up, took a stretch. As she did this, she heard a kind of tapping and rattling sound coming from upstairs. It sounded like it was coming from the position of the ceiling where her bedroom would be. Margaret wasn't at all worried. She just assumed that it was Pep that had gone up before her and was settling under her bed, as this is something that Pep would often do when she saw Margaret stand up, take a stretch, and indicate that she would perhaps be moving to the bedroom. Margaret then stepped towards the stairs that were at the back of the lounge. She took one last stretch before she started to walk up the narrow wooden stairs. She then came onto a small landing where there was 2 doorways, one which led to Margaret's bedroom and a second that led to her parents' room. Margaret then followed her normal bedtime routine and stepped into her parents' room. In her parents' room, there was a large mirror that was by the wall just by the doorway, and right next to the mirror was a large oak cupboard. Her parents' bed was then directly opposite the mirror and the wardrobe. The reason that Margaret had entered her parents' room was to get her nightdress out of the wardrobe, as all of the family's clothes were stored here. After getting into her nightdress, Margaret retired to her own bedroom, popped into bed. She then pulled over the duvet to keep herself warm. Within a few minutes, Margaret was already sound asleep. At around 2 a.m, Margaret woke up, startled. She just felt really uneasy. She felt she could hear something. She could hear a drip, drip, drip coming from her parents' room, but was reassured when she placed her hand down beside her bed and had a lick on the hand in the pitch black. Margaret then just thought to herself that it must have been raining and it must be some dripping coming from the roof outside. She then placed her hand down for a second time, got a reassuring look, rolled over in bed, pulled her covers up and fell back immediately to sleep. At 3 a.m, Margaret woke up again, startled. She felt really uneasy this time, more so than the last time, and she could still hear that continuous drip, drip, drip. She was slightly more alarmed this time because she didn't think that she could hear any rain on the windows from outside. And in 1877 there was no plumbing that could have caused any leaking, and there was no leaks in the roof that she knew of. Margaret laid in bed and started to feel slightly frightened. She couldn't work out where this sound was coming from. She placed her hand down and again got another reassuring lick on her hand. After laying in bed underneath the covers, Margaret decided that she was going to go and investigate. She plucked up the courage and she lit a candle which was next to her bed. Margaret crept and slowly walked into her parents' room, proceeding with caution. She peered round the corner and looked at the mirror. What Margaret then saw on the mirror absolutely terrified her. She felt the palms of her hands immediately become sweaty and clammy. Her knees began shaking. Her eyes began to fill up with water as she just felt this overwhelming sensation of fear. There on the mirror, what appeared to be in blood was spelt out, "Humans can lick too." Despite being absolutely terrified, Margaret just could not resist. She felt she just had this urge and she had to check what was in the wardrobe. So she opened that wardrobe door immediately. As soon as she did this, she screamed. There she found what the dripping was. Pep had been beheaded and it was the dripping of her blood, tapping and dripping on the bottom of the wardrobe. Before Margaret had any chance to process her fear, she then heard a rustling coming from her bedroom. She couldn't see much as it was extremely dark and the only light she has was from the candle in her hand. But she could make out in the moonlight coming from her window the dark, tall figure of a human, a man. She could hear extremely heavy breathing, almost as if that person was getting excited and even exhilarated by the whole ordeal. As that figure stepped out from under the bed, she could make out that he had something in his hand. She caught what it was in the moonlight. It was an axe. Margaret, unfortunately, was frozen, terrified with fear. She couldn't seem to move her legs. She couldn't move her arms. She couldn't even scream. All Margaret could do was just watch this figure come closer and closer until this shadow stood in front of her, raised the axe and brought it down upon Margaret's head. Margaret's parents returned the next day to a horrific crime scene. All they found left of Margaret was her little finger and a pool of blood by the wardrobe. There was a blood trail all the way down the stairs, through the lounge and out the front door. Multiple police officers and over 100 local villagers tried to search for Margaret, but no body or no Margaret was ever found. Many people believe to this day that this tale was shared by her killer, and that he continued to tell people so that he could try and relive that exhilarating power that he felt when he committed the gruesome murder. Although there is no evidence of Margaret or any other similar murders, there are many variants of the story dating back to the 17th century. The very first recorded possible origin was in 1871, written by the diary of a Victorian squire, Dearman Birchall, who wrote that one of his guests told of a clergyman that was aroused in the middle of the night by his wife, who said, "Dear John, I'm sure there's a robber under our bed. I can hear him moving. Do get up and see." John replied, "Oh, it's only the Newfoundland dog. I put my hand out and he licked it." The next morning, all the jewellery and many other effects had disappeared. This story isn't perhaps as gory or gruesome as Margaret's tale, but it's still extremely disturbing to think that a person was in their bedroom, under their bed, waiting, watching, listening, and that they crept out while they were most vulnerable and asleep. So when you go to bed tonight, be sure to check under that bed. Thank you for listening. And if you haven't already, please do like and subscribe.